lurch to the right would be a big mistake. And I do think some of the criticism that's coming from Suella Braverman and others is really focused about that post-election leadership race that is likely to follow, and the direction of the party that will be determined by that race.
Rishi Sunak's claim that the local election results suggest a hung parliament at the general election. Scarlett Maguire of the pollsters JL Partners spoke to Times Radio a short time ago.
They're clinging on to this assessment, which has sort of been extrapolated from Sky's national equivalent vote. So they would, they do this every year, working out, roughly speaking, what the local election results would look like had they been replicated across the country. Now, I think there's some caveats to this, which is firstly, people behave quite differently in local elections. So obviously their views of national parties do influence how they vote. But fundamentally, they are voting for people to be in charge of the bins. They're not voting for who should be in charge of the foreign policy on Israel Gaza, for example, though actually that's probably not a great example because some people were voting on that issue in these. But so, for example, you had Labour was given a real kicking in Tyneside by a series of independents who unseated several people from that council, and that was apparently over bins. So, it's lots of things that go into these elections.
Well, earlier I spoke to David Gauke, former Conservative Justice Secretary and political commentator, who told me what he made of the claims of a potential hung parliament.
I can see why he's making it, because at one level, you want to provide a bit of encouragement to your own supporters. And second, if you go back to, say, 2015, the argument about we're going to end up with a Labour SNP coalition was very effective. But I think most of the pollsters are right. If you look at the evidence from the votes we had last week, it is a bit hard to extrapolate that and argue that we are heading for a hung parliament. There are a lot of people down as voting for others, for smaller parties, many of them parties like the Greens, where you'd expect those voters to end up with the Labour Party. And look, I think the best assessment of what's happening with the electorate is probably the opinion polls anyway. And from a Conservative perspective, they're not really suggesting a hung parliament, but a very large Labour majority. But look, Rishi Sunak's got to make some arguments and try and provide a little bit of hope for Conservative Party supporters.
I was covering David Cameron's campaign back in 2015, and I remember that message of the campaign that you'd get a coalition of chaos if you vote for the Labour Party under Ed Miliband, and we had those posters of Ed Miliband in Alex Salmond's pocket. And it was an effective campaign then, but the political landscape was so different. And I just wonder whether Rishi Sunak saying to voters, look, you're going to have a coalition of chaos, is actually going to seem reasonable to voters who look at the chaos under the Conservatives of the last few years.
I think that's right. Yes, I think it's hard for the Conservatives to contrast themselves with anybody else and argue that the other lots represent chaos. I think there is also the point that back in 2015, Alex Salmond was a very high-profile figure, pretty unpopular in England. We'd obviously just had the Scottish independence referendum, and there was an expectation that the SNP, rightly as it turned out, were going to have a very large representation from Scotland, and they were going to be quite powerful if there wasn't a Conservative majority. So, that did work really well, and I was campaigning in that election, and it really did resonate. We know the SNP are frankly in decline. John Swinney is not a high-profile figure, and nobody really expects the SNP to have the whip hand over Keir Starmer. So I'm not sure that you can replicate that argument in quite the same way. I think the sort of best you can say of Rishi Sunak's argument is that it might provide a little bit of encouragement, as I say, to Conservative MPs and Conservative activists that they're not quite out of it yet.
What Rishi Sunak has been saying is that he thinks the result is going to be closer than the predictions suggest and that it's all still there to play for, but that's going to be even harder. Now you've lost so many councillors, or the Conservatives have lost so many councillors across the country.
Yes, I think that's right. In fact, what I think might turn out to be a better argument, but it's not one that Rishi Sunak can use, is, do you really want a Labour Party with a huge majority? And, don't we need some kind of functioning opposition party? And that's a reason for voting for the Conservatives. It's a little bit of a sort of flip. I think there's a comparison that could be made with what Labour said in 2017, or what a lot of voters perceived the situation being, is that they didn't want to give Theresa May a huge majority, didn't want a huge Conservative majority. So people ended up voting Labour, and Labour did better than anyone expected. And, there possibly is an argument to be made. One of the better arguments, I think, for voting Conservative is, hold on, we don't want Labour to have too big a majority, and we do need a proper functioning opposition. But of course, that's a very hard argument for Rishi Sunak to make, and it's not the one he will be making.
He seems to have avoided a challenge to his leadership, but there is clearly a battle going on already for the future direction of the Conservative Party. We had Suella Braverman saying that the party needs to change course. She clearly wants a very right-wing approach to the electorate. What do you make of that?
Well, you're absolutely right. There is that argument going on, and I do think a lurch to the right would be a big mistake. And I do think some of the criticism that's coming from Suella Braverman and others is really focused about that post-election leadership race that is likely to follow, and the direction of the party that will be determined by that race. I think it's worth looking at what's happened in these local election results. And yes, someone like Andy Street did lose, but only by a whisker, and did remarkably well as a pragmatic, practical, pro-business, moderate figure that was seeking to reach out and appeal across the board. In contrast, if you look at what happened in London against Sadiq Khan, who frankly was vulnerable. He's got some unpopular policies, and his record on certain areas is not that impressive. But Susan Hall ran a very right-wing campaign, pretty negative, pessimistic, didn't appear to like London very much. And the Conservatives failed to take advantage of what should have been quite a good opportunity. So I think there are lessons to be learnt from those mayoral campaigns, when it was not a great set of results for the Conservatives overall. But, I think a lurch to the right will just make the task of the Tories recovering much, much harder.
Well, that's the former Justice Secretary David Gauke.